when you're really in the weeds of podcasting, you're almost ticking jobs off a list, and it can be very hard to think about what you've done, and then it's a step further to think about what you've done and what you could do with that, the other ways that that content could exist and attract an audience and help you to further your mission or the business that you're advertising through the podcast. So I think sometimes when I'm sort of knee deep in spreadsheets and transcripts and so on, I'm seeing patterns that possibly nobody has spotted before in the podcast. And that's the really nice thing about my job that I personally love, that I can pull things together and turn around to the podcaster and say, look, you did this. Let's let people know about it.
It is time for Build That Podcast, where we will discuss how you can use a podcast to grow your business and expand your influence. I'm your host, Eric Rutherford. Let me encourage you to sign up for the 200 words to move you forward with marketing and podcasting, delivered right to your inbox each Tuesday. Sign up for it at buildthatpodcast.com/the 200. I'll also put it in the show notes. Now, let's jump into today's episode. And I'm excited today because I have with me Sarah Hopkinson. She is a longtime copywriter. She's also founder of CopyHop, whose goal is to create show-stopping written work that's inspired by your podcast. And what it does is it helps establish your authority and highlight your best episodes and ideas. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hi, Eric. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I was so thankful to connect through LinkedIn and that you accepted the invite. I think what you're doing is fabulous and so needed. And I thought, wow, let's just get this out into the world and help people see the value of some of the things that you provide. I'm trying not to do any spoilers. So, early in the show, we'll get into all of that, but we're just thrilled to have the conversation. So just kind of before we get into CopyHop and the work you're doing there, what first drew your attention to podcasts? Because as you were copywriting and then going from almost written to audio, what drew your attention to podcasts?
Well, if I follow it in chronological order, I was first interested in podcasts. And when I started to get into the world of podcasts, I was working in online marketing. And I think like 90% of other people at the time, I got into podcasts through the Serial podcast. And I expanded outwards from there quite quickly. It was something that I would do walking to work or going, long distance traveling. I started to get into listening to podcasts to fill in that time. And I haven't really looked back. And I love that it's it's a medium that's great for learning and is also very intimate. So when I started my copywriting business, I thought, wow, what a fantastic opportunity I have here to run my own business and work in an area that's a real passion for me, and that's also a helpful tool to help people to grow their own businesses.
I like that. I like how I kind of got into podcasting the same way. Started listening on commutes and other places. So I like how you were able to take something that you were just enjoying and finding great value in, and then being able to connect it to a business opportunity and your skill set. So that makes total sense. So then let's just jump into CopyHop. What is CopyHop?
CopyHop is the business that I created. I founded it in 2021. So the name is based on copywriting and Hopkinson, my surname. I put the two words together, and I started out by providing show notes for podcasters, but that quickly expanded to providing, as well as show notes, content repurposing in the form of blog posts. And I thought over time it was a service that more and more podcasters were asking me to do. And I thought, well, there's a real opportunity here to go a bit beyond simple content repurposing and to turn podcast content into something that's new and exciting and different, that still carries this same essential message from the podcast. And I came up with a kind of visual metaphor to describe this that you can see if you go on my website, because I liken it to creating a podcast content cocktail, and that makes me the content mixologist. So I see it as taking ideas from one episode over here, an episode over there, something that the guest said last year that's become interesting and relevant in a new way, and putting this all together in a really neat package for the podcaster, which might look like a guide or an email. So I like to take the ideas and shake them up and turn it into something new that's more than the sum of its parts.
I think that's brilliant. I've seen a lot of other instances where people will repurpose from individual podcasts or do something of that nature. But I really like the bringing together of different ideas from different podcasts and that sort of mixing. I love that metaphor. I thought that was really cool of bringing those different ideas together. So is that kind of the problem you were looking to solve? You saw all of these disparate pieces, or people just weren't leveraging their podcasts? What kind of problem were you like, I can fix this for people?
I think this kind of content repurposing solves a couple of problems. As you say, it helps podcasters to really leverage the content that's in their archives. And it's a new way to market the content that you already have. And also podcasters are constantly pressed for time, and the algorithm and the nature of podcasting means that you're always looking to the horizon. What's my next episode going to be about? I've got to think about booking my next guest, and you're kind of being pulled forwards. And it means that you don't really have the time or resources to look back and to make the most of the content that you already have. And you invested time into that content and money into creating that content. And if you're not squeezing every ounce back out of it, then you're kind of losing out on your ROI. So it was a way, so my services combine these two together, that I take the work out away from the podcaster and I do it for them, and it helps their business to grow. And it promotes their podcast, builds their authority, and it also helps the listeners of the podcast to really absorb the message and the learnings that you're trying to teach them through the podcast.
No, that makes total sense. So if you're listening and you're thinking about starting a podcast, let me offer up everything she said is absolutely true. It is sort of this content, a bit of a content hamster wheel,
yes,
so to speak.
Definitely.
Just because you are trying to be consistent, you're churning out, and it's easy to let that content, once it's been posted, to not do anything else with it. So I think what you're doing is incredibly valuable within that regard, and can be used by just about every podcaster out there. And you mentioned a little bit earlier the different types of content you create from podcasts. And it sounds like it can be from a single podcast, from multiple podcasts. Would you elaborate a little bit on that and kind of some ways you've been creating that content and how it can be used?
Of course, yeah. I have created a few different kinds of content for podcasts. It really depends, from my perspective, where that podcaster's audience is hanging out online. because you need to go to where they are to be able to share the content in its most effective form. So if the podcaster has an active email list, I would write out their content and send it in a series of emails, which the podcaster can announce is a special series. It's not just an email where we're saying my next episode is online, tune into it. It might be a sort of 5-part email series where you say, I'm going to come through my podcast archives and tell you the lessons I've learned while podcasting on a particular theme. For example, if you are a financial coach, it might be preparing for maternity or paternity leave and how you can save your money to cover this time where you have decreased revenue and increased expenses, something like that. So it could be an email series, or if the podcaster has an active website that draws in a lot of traffic, you can take the same idea but turn it into a blog post or a short series of blog posts. I also I ghostwrite for people who have a large following on LinkedIn, where they're leading the conversation by turning their podcast episodes and podcast content into engaging LinkedIn content. And another kind of content, which is a slightly larger project, would be to turn their podcast content into something like a written guide, which the podcaster can either sell or give away in the form of a lead magnet, which the aim of that would really be to cover a lot of the content from their archives in a way that the listener can understand and have it to refer to in the future, instead of having to comb through many episodes from the podcast archives.
I like all of those options. I can definitely see how they would be helpful to businesses, to people, depending on where they're at. I'd really like that, both the email and the LinkedIn. From my perspective, one that you can really drive people to your email list when they know, hey, I've got a series of 4 to 6 emails coming out with this content involved. It's almost the serialization, kind of like what you were talking about earlier, right? Which sort of drew you to podcasts initially. Have you seen people been able to kind of leverage that to grow their list?
It's definitely a big attraction to join the list. It's a way for you to really promise value to your listeners and to make the email list more than, as I said before, a weekly reminder that you have a podcast. So it's a fantastic way to grow your email list, and then you're building trust with your audience, and it could be a sequence leading up to a specific course that you then, or a product that you want to push through your email list. So it's definitely a way to highlight the value of your podcast content and your list without detracting one from the other.
I like that. And that makes so much sense in terms of being able to add value to your listeners and trying to move them towards your email list. And then you mentioned, like with LinkedIn, are those like multiple posts? Is that like a series, like one a week for a year? What can that look like?
I personally really like writing the series posts, so it can be what the client wants, but I enjoy this idea of taking themes that you've covered from episodes, and it's a great way to direct people to episodes from across your archives and to highlight the value of what you've said or what a guest has said, maybe a long time after that episode came out, but in quite a natural way, because you can say, this week or this month, I'm reflecting on lessons that I've learned about marketing or management. So it can be standalone posts, but I think that you have more to say and you can make the content more interesting if you can point to specific things that you've learned or how your opinion has evolved over time, and you can really track that by saying, in this episode I thought this, and now today, thanks to these people's opinions and these experiences, I'm saying this. And that's the kind of content that tends to get a lot of engagement on LinkedIn and would showcase your podcast in a very natural way that also really shows your authority in the subject area.
I like that. That makes so much sense. From sort of a high level view, I know for me personally, sometimes I get too far down in the weeds and the details, and I can't really see the connections between all of the episodes. Again, I'm like, okay, what's this next episode going to be? And so I focus on the too granular and not the bigger picture, which it sounds like you're able to capture and identify a lot of these things that almost the podcast host may not even see themselves.
Definitely. I mean, I don't want to say that I know the podcast better than the podcast host, because it's their little pod baby and they can be very precious about the thing that they've built. But as you say, when you're really in the weeds of podcasting, you're almost ticking jobs off a list, and it can be very hard to think about what you've done, and then it's a step further to think about what you've done and what you could do with that, the other ways that content could exist and attract an audience and help you to further your mission or the business that you're advertising through the podcast. So I think sometimes when I'm sort of knee deep in spreadsheets and transcripts and so on, I'm seeing patterns that possibly nobody has spotted before in the podcast. And that's the really nice thing about my job that I personally love, that I can pull things together and turn around to the podcaster and say, look, you did this. Let's let people know about it.
That's fascinating. And just this idea of being able to elaborate, to be able to make those connection points. It's almost like you're a researcher working with sort of original sources, bringing together this picture and this idea of their overall thoughts. How does your process work? Because as I'm listening to this, I think it's fascinating. I'm just curious, what's this process look like for you? And even with, you can feel free to both your process or how you work with a podcaster in terms of making all of this happen. I'll let you go either direction.
Well, normally when I work with a podcaster, I always like to have a call to begin with, to get to know them a little bit and to discuss the outline of the project and what they want their podcast to become, their podcast content to become, and their goals. And then at that point, I have to take a really good look into their archives and get really kind of knee deep in the weeds, in the transcripts, because the next stage is a kind of data collation stage where I'll be tracking particular themes that they've followed across their podcast and working out who said what, which episode, when they said it, why they said it. And I'll end up with a spreadsheet where I've logged data points. And then that point is really exciting because you can see so much potential. And actually, once you've laid that foundation where you have a spreadsheet where you've tracked and tagged content, it could become endless different kinds of content. The sky's the limit for repurposing, really. But from then I will go into a writing phase where I will lay out a skeleton structure that the podcaster could then check to see that we're on the same page and they can see how I'm doing. And from then I will write it out. And at that point, I spend a lot of time thinking about that podcaster's unique voice and how that would translate from spoken content to written content. This is something that is a part of the process that's tricky to get right. So I've really worked and reflected on it a lot, because when we speak, we sound one way, and that's often not exactly how we write. And one of my main goals is that the content that I write sounds exactly like how it would sound had the podcaster written it for themselves. So I have to do a lot of comparing and contrasting to make sure that we are maintaining consistency and that it translates in quite a natural way. And then at that point, once it's all written up, I hand it back to the podcaster, and then they depending on the format, sometimes they want graphic design input, in which case I refer them out to some great connections I have, and other times it goes online, or they'll sell it or give it away. But that's my process end to end.
So I knew a lot went into it, but I didn't realize that much went into it in terms of the scope and scale of being able to get into the transcripts, about making the connections, and even about trying. I had never thought about writing in a speaking voice and how that differs. But now that you mention, I'm like, yeah, I do sound different, and other people sound different between when you're writing and when you're speaking. It's obvious, and yet it's not.
Yes, it's one of the. It's a very difficult thing to do to get right, because when you look at a transcript of natural speech, it's messy. Human speech is messy. Your brain tricks you into thinking that it's simple, but actually it's very rare that you speak in a complete sentence. If it's a conversation between two people, which often podcasts are, there's frequent overlaps, and you hear it and it sounds fine, and you see it written down and you think, how does anyone understand anything ever? So I focus on the tone of voice of the podcaster, how they generally speak about the topics that they are interested in, what their outlook for those topics is, the particular words they use or particular analogies. And I do a big tidying up job on the grammar and building it into sentences that are easy to read and understand.
I have been tinkering with transcripts and just trying to make them somewhat readable, primarily for the SEO and for some other reasons. And you're absolutely right. It is just, you read a transcript and you're thinking, how do these people communicate ever?
Yes.
It's like there's repeat words, there's stutters, there's stammers, there's going back and forth. It is, to read a transcript is challenging. And so translating that as you're doing has to be, I mean, it's a lot of work, but even more, the end product is wonderful. It has to be this great experience for a reader to understand what's been going on in this podcaster sphere.
Yeah, it was something that I noticed, first of all, when I was working primarily with podcast show notes. Some of the podcasters would ask me, oh, could you choose 2 or 3 highlight quotes from the episode that I can share on my social media? And on the surface, that sounds like a very simple request. But I was looking at the transcript, knowing that they wanted something short and punchy, and I would have a quote that where the guest would take perhaps up to a minute and a half to explain a point, and you as the listener, you understand it, but when you're reading it, it's very different. So I was having to cut a lot and almost sort of Dr. Frankenstein a quote together for the podcaster. But one of my favorite facts really is that the first time that people really noticed this discrepancy was as a result of the Watergate scandal, because there were transcripts of everything that was being said. And when you hear it, you get the gist of what's going on, that there's this, this blackmail element, and that they're talking about all these different people. But when you read the transcripts, it's an utter mess, and people genuinely thought that the transcripts couldn't possibly be real, because they didn't think that speech was like that. And it took listening to the recording and matching the recording to the transcripts for people to realize that speech sounds one way and looks very much another.
I had no idea that they thought those transcripts were not real just because of the way they came out and the way they were transcribed. That's fascinating. And a little, I say a little unnerving, not in that sense, but just in the sense of, wow, we just don't understand how different we speak and write.
Yes, the brain is amazing. It does this clear up job for us, and then that's what I'm replicating in my work.
Is there a minimum recommended amount of episodes for you to work with someone? It sounds like because you cover a large scale and scope of episodes, I didn't know, is there like a certain number at a minimum to work with you and for you to find the best information?
I would always say to a podcaster that repurposing content can start from episode 1, and should start from episode 1, so that you can start to garner those SEO advantages and to promote and spread your work. But for the services that I offer, I prefer to work with podcasters that have been podcasting for about 6 months, assuming that they are podcasting or releasing episodes once a week. So when we hit the 6-month mark or beyond that, at that point, the podcast host is a bit more relaxed into it. They have a bit more of a natural rhythm and feel for how the show should sound. And at that point, they've also hopefully got a team around them who know a bit what they're doing. And at that point, the podcast will start to have recurring themes. And that's where it's really interesting for me to get in there and get my hands in and start working with the podcast, and where they get the most amount of benefit from my services. So I would say 6 months is the earliest, and if they've been going for a year or 2 years, then that's really ideal.
That makes so much sense, because I think even for a podcaster who's doing a podcast, it can take 25 to 30 episodes just to get in rhythm and find your voice. And so that makes total sense of that's kind of a minimum number just for you to then be able to go back in and track a voice and track some themes, because it takes some repetitions to get on board. But I love that idea of, anybody with 1 year to 2 years of content minimum, you could pull some fantastic pieces together from that. It sounds like you have.
Definitely. There's so much potential in the content that you already have. And if you work in content marketing, you know that it doesn't hurt to repeat a message so that your customers can understand it. And by packaging your messaging up a little bit differently, not just, oh, this is what we said on this topic, but doing a kind of compare and contrast analysis, or by exploring different themes from within your messaging overall, you can really start to turn that content into something that people actually want to read. And of course, that is the goal of marketing overall. So you need a little bit of creativity, but there are so many different ways that all of these pieces can be shaken up and served in a fresh, different way. You have to start.
No, that's an excellent point. You just have to start. Now, one thing you mentioned earlier, and I wanted to get into a little more, are show notes. So what in your experience and as you have worked with different podcasters, and even just in your own observations, what makes show notes stand out from the other shows?
That's a great question. I always say show notes stand out when they deliver value to the listener. Podcast show notes could look like anything. There isn't one format that would be correct for every podcast. But personally, I am annoyed when the podcast show notes are just the socials links of the podcast and the guest, because it's a real missed opportunity to help the listener and to attract the listener to your podcast in the first place. So I would say when you're writing podcast show notes, certainly when I was writing them for podcasters, you need to reel the listener in, hook them in, and tell them why the podcast is worth listening to. And for that, you can open up a curiosity gap that you don't have to close immediately. And then you need to explain a couple of the key points from the podcast, all the while underlining this is what you'll learn when you listen to the episode. And also you need to give the guest, the listener, the resources to go and find out more if they want to. And that's where the socials links should come in. So those are the basic ingredients of good podcast show notes. But you could also see your podcast show notes as an extension of the podcast experience. So they should reflect the tone that you talk in, whether that's humorous or informative or dramatic. And it can become part of the show for your listeners and something that they really enjoy reading. That is great podcast show notes in my mind.
That sounds fabulous to me in terms of what show notes can be and should be. Drawing the listener in, really moving them to engage with the podcast, opening that, did you call it that curiosity gap? Is that the phrase you use?
Yes, exactly. In the same way that if you have an email in your inbox and the subject line of the email titillates you in some way that you read it and think, oh, I don't know that. They're asking me a question or they're saying something that's unusual. Your podcast show notes can do that too. I wouldn't recommend doing that in the title because the title needs to be really focused on the SEO of the podcast, but your podcast show notes can open with a line that can inspire the listener to want to know more. I have an email list myself, and I did a whole email about the 10 different formula for opening your podcast show notes, which sometimes it's a question, sometimes it's setting a scenario that your listener can immediately place themselves in. Sometimes it's saying something that's obviously factually wrong, and the listener thinks, oh, what? No. And then you correct that as you go along. So you can do all of this through great podcast show notes.
I had not thought of all of the opportunities and options for really leading in with show notes. So this is incredibly helpful to me. If you're listening, I hope you're taking notes as well, because I think show notes are often overlooked as a way to boost and provide value to your listeners. So it sounds then like you think show notes can be a competitive advantage for someone's podcast. That as I'm listening to you, it sounds like, wow, you can really set yourself apart and make it a competitive advantage. Do you see that as well?
Definitely. Podcast show notes can be a bit the unloved element of podcasting. And I 100% understand when you're a podcaster, you're very busy and perhaps you hate writing show notes. That I have no problem with you hating writing show notes. But that doesn't mean that your show notes shouldn't be good. You should still, they are an opportunity for you to grow your podcast and help your listeners, and you should treat them as such. So if you don't like writing your podcast show notes, maybe look into outsourcing that as a task. But I would say there are 3 reasons why great podcast show notes help you to stand out and give you that competitive advantage that you were referring to, Eric, with the first reason being that when you have your podcast show notes online, you can include SEO search terms, keywords that would help potential listeners to find the podcast. They can also, as I was explaining before, help to guide the listener through the podcast and explain questions to them, give them extra information and resources that they can use if they want to know more and research by themselves. And the last reason why great podcast show notes is an advantage for your podcast is that when your podcast show notes are good, it becomes so much easier for you to start repurposing your podcast content, because the show notes tell you at a glance what you said, what the episode is about. And if you have good timestamps as well, you can find out exactly when those great golden moments are in the episode. So you've already done almost half of the work towards repurposing your podcast content, because it's like having it's a label for that content. It's like a library index almost, and once you have several of those, you can think, oh great, okay, I know what my content is about, I know when I said it, now all I have to do is to put it together, rewrite it, repurpose it, and let it live as something else.
If you're listening, I don't know how you're feeling. I know how I'm feeling right now. I'm feeling like, wow, I have totally missed an opportunity with my show notes.
It's never too late, Eric.
Right now. And so I appreciate that encouragement, because I'm thinking, wow, I have totally missed an opportunity. Do you have like 1 or 2 podcasts that you could point listeners to say, hey, here's an example of what I am doing with people's show notes, that I could drop that in my inadequate show notes, and at least give them a link to go look and see what good show notes look like? Any place you would want to point them?
Sure. I have been working for quite some time, over a year, I would say, with a podcast network called Local Talent, which is run by a podcaster down in Texas. And he has a podcast called Local Talent, The Entrepreneur's Handbook, which is all about business, and a sister podcast called Local Politics, where he and a friend interview politicians on their local city council, their mayors, and so on. Those podcast show notes, you can see how I've also turned them into blog posts as well. And if you take a glance through them, you'll notice that there are certain elements of my house style of show notes where it's really quite a detailed episode summary, around 200 words, and timestamps that highlight key moments in all of the episodes. So that, I would say, is an example of podcast show notes where you're getting the SEO benefits, because I make sure to include key search terms, and they're, hopefully, I think you'll agree that they're well written. And also there's the standard things such as links to the guest and the business.
Excellent. So I will make sure to put a couple of links in the show notes. So if you're listening, you're like, hey, I'm interested. I want to see more of what show notes can look like. I'll make sure that there's a couple of links in the show notes for you to check out. We've got just a couple more minutes. I'll just throw out there one takeaway. Is there anything you would like to leave the audience with as they're thinking about repurposing content, whether it's show notes, whether it's about articles, any takeaway you would like to leave for them?
I would say to all podcasters, regardless of where you are at in your podcasting journey, you're sitting on incredibly valuable content. It's there, it's in your archives, and that content can become so many other kinds of content, whether that's, as I said, your emails, your blogs, your social media, or even a full book. But if you want to really move forward with your podcast, you have to start by looking backwards. But if you have any problems with that, or if you don't know where to start, then I'm here to help.
I love that. And it is so true. The content in the podcasts, it is a gold mine of content that you can repurpose. And so, I'm so glad you're mentioning that, you're bringing it up, that you're working on that. If listeners want to know more about you, about your work, about how to contact you, where would you like them to go?
Well, I'd love for them to go to my website, which is copyhop.co. That's copyhop.co. And from there, you can find descriptions of my services. You can get in touch with me or join my email list and find out the links for where else I am online.
Excellent. So that's copyhop.co. I'll put that in the show notes as well. If you're listening, go to the website, reach out to her with questions, get on her email list. Her email list has some fabulous content. I've signed up and I'm reading and learning. So it's great stuff. So Sarah, thank you for joining me today. This has just been a fun conversation. I have learned a ton.
Thanks very much, Eric. I really enjoyed chatting to you.
Make sure to sign up for the 200 at buildthatpodcast.com/the 200 and receive 200 words every Tuesday to move you forward with marketing and podcasting, delivered right to your inbox. Lastly, if you have questions or comments, you can find me on LinkedIn at Eric Rutherford, DM me on Twitter at rfordej, or email me at eric@straightforwardmg.com. Remember, use podcasts to grow your business and expand your influence.